I'm Chris McDonough, a retired homicide detective. I've interviewed thousands of people, from serial killers to ministers. Welcome to the interview room. Welcome to the interview room, everybody. Have I got a show for you tonight? Oh my goodness. Put your seatbelts on and take a seat. I've got Greg Cooper in the house.
Hello, everybody.
Oh my gosh. I got Dean Jackson and Tom McHoes, investigative journalist. I hope you're ready to have a good time. We are going to talk bad guys, predators. Put your seatbelts on. Greg has a new book titled Predators. And we're going to talk about that personality tonight. We're going to talk about predators in Delphi, predators in Summer's case. We're going to talk about that mindset. So take a seat, get comfortable, because here we come. Hit that like and share button. Get your friends here. So, Greg, they're playing our songs. Tommy, Dean.
It's great to be here with you again, Chris.
It's great to have you.
It's always a privilege.
Yeah. Great to be here with Tom and Dean as well.
What
Talk
did you?
about some things that are interesting, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see you guys. You know, what's been going on? What's been going on your side?
What's been new? Well, you know, with the Cold Case Foundation, we're just going crazy with all kinds of things happening.
Yep.
We're getting ready for some training coming up online from our Global Academy that we're going to start. Was it toward the end of July?
July 27th.
Yeah,
July 27th. Yeah.
Tell the audience about that, Dean.
Yeah, so July 27th, we're going to do a victimology workshop. Greg's going to be taking everybody kind of on a journey to understand a little bit better about victimology, how we look at that from an investigative perspective. And so if you go out to our website, you can either find directions to it either at coldcasefoundation.org or at coldcase.live. You can find it out there as well. And we'd love to have everybody join us. So we'll be going live on July 27th from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And we'd love to have you come along.
Awesome.
Yeah, this is our first step in that direction. We've been planning for this for a long time. So we expect that there's going to be some hiccups along the way. But we're excited to put it out there and to see how it goes, see how it's received.
Awesome. And now who's this guy above me here in the Brady Bunch group? Tommy, good to see you again. It's great to see you.
Good to see you too. Yeah, I've kind of been behind the scenes this whole time, and Greg felt it was time to put me out there. He seems to think I have a personality. So we'll
it really depends on how well you do tonight, Tom.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, tell everybody a little bit about yourself, about your, who you are, Tom, and you're a member of the Cold Case Foundation, but tell everybody how you and Dean met. Something about ducks or something like that back in the day. Not really sure.
Yeah, so I used to be an investigative journalist, and this is back, in the early to mid '90s. I started my career in Sacramento. With a newspaper called the Roseville Press Tribune. If you got anybody up in NorCal, hi, I miss ya. About then, I moved to Utah, and got on with in Central Utah with a newspaper called the Provo Daily Herald, which Greg was the police chief in Provo. I think for a while, I was giving him some headaches, so he probably called it the Daily Headache. Instead of the Daily Herald when we got there, but I did notice there's a little duck icon up there by predators, at least that we can see. I don't know if that is something that you always do or just something that I'm seeing, but yeah. Gosh, we didn't start off on the right foot. I hadn't met Greg. He had a public information officer, and I did the police beat. That was my first assignment, was with the police beat. And I did that for a couple of years. But early on, I handled a number of different things, armed robberies, with some homicides, some things like that, real like high profile cases. And it never really caught the attention of our editor-in-chief. And I don't think I've told you this part of the story, Greg. I get a call one beautiful, lazy Sunday afternoon from our editor-in-chief, who's over the entire publication. And he's just really serious. He says, Tom, there's been these ducks slaughtered near this pond in this park in Provo. You got to get out there and find out what happened. The police aren't doing anything about it, and the members of this community are outraged. And I'm just kind of I'm a little confused at that point, because I've never gotten a call. His name is Paul Richards. I've never gotten a call from Paul before, and it's about ducks. But okay, it sounds like it's big. I go out there, and there's 6, 7, 8 ducks laying there, and it's a sad scene, but. Again, the editor-in-chief has called me on this. Okay, I'll do this. So I thought, we'll do it. We'll look into it. I call the police department. The public information officer is off on Sundays, and the dispatcher answers. And to be honest, she gives me this attitude like, oh my gosh, you're calling about these ducks. And I'm kind of going, I'm really trying to let you off easy here. I just kind of have a few questions. Do we have anybody that I can talk to? No, nobody's here to talk about the ducks. And, I'm kind of going, okay. So I write this up, just kind of saying, yeah, this is what the dispatcher said. And this is the tone she had. And these people are outraged, and this community, they're getting the same thing. So then I get this call from Chief Cooper, whom I also had never talked to before. And he wants to have a little meeting in his office. And this is about 2 days later. Meanwhile, my editor-in-chief is just breathing down my, have you gotten any resolution to this thing? What's going on? And I'm going, wow, why don't you call me on any of these homicide cases? I've got some other investigative things going on, but these ducks really seem to have you bothered. So we'll keep going. So I go down to Chief Cooper's office, and I get immediately greeted, by the secretary. And yeah, Chief Cooper's been expecting you. And it's just very, somber, you just wait. The principal's gonna, he's gonna give it to you, right? So I go in, and there he is, and there's a couple of investigative team, and he says, well, we just want you to know that we got the culprits, right? Here they are. We just wanted to talk to you personally, since this is obviously a big deal to you. And then Greg lets me have it. I just want you to know, we had to take off, two detectives from other cases, and we put them on this, and blah, 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 he just gives me the business, and I hope you're happy, and that's kind of and there's half of me that wanted to say, well, yes, I am happy. Ducks are people too, and so I'm glad you did that.
That's awesome. That's
the
awesome.
The larger half of me was like, well, I kind of see where you're coming from, because I don't get why this is a big deal either. There's maybe a police piece. Well, I go back to the office, write the story up, and as I'm walking through the office, Paul jumps out of his office and grabs, hey, I need to talk to you. Pulls me into his office. I'd never had a one-on-one conversation with him in the office. And this is what he tells me, and I don't think this is the part I've ever told you, Greg. As he said, so we've got, this is all right. We've got a resolution to this. We're good. You just wrote this up, right? Yeah, there's a couple of kids, they got out of hand, but they've got them, right? They're being charged, etc. And he sits down, he just wipes his brow and he goes, oh, thank goodness. And I go, what? He goes, my wife has been on me over this. This is her best friend that lived in the community, and they have been all over me. I can finally go home and tell her we put it to bed. That was my first aha moment, that it's not always about newsworthiness.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Great. Well, that's a great story. And wow. I have to agree with this comment. What a great group of men assembled here. And we got folks from all over the world here right now, just chiming in to hear what we're going to, put up here tonight in relationship to not only the book and, why you wrote the book. And, Tommy was, the one of the authors on the book with Greg, and you guys have added a couple of chapters to your additional book called Predators. But I think it's so apropos for this time right now, where we have this little Summer Wells and we have the Delphi young girls that have been found deceased. Some are still out there. But the way I want to approach this tonight with everybody, and Dean, I don't know, for our viewers who do not know who everybody is, Greg was the unit chief in the FBI, the Behavior Analysis Unit, or the BAU, or Behavior Science Unit. What did you guys call it back in the day? Was it? Well,
when I was there, it was called the Investigative Support Unit, and they changed that subsequently. I think it's now called the Behavioral Science Unit, or maybe the Behavioral Analysis Unit now.
Okay, BAU. And you actually brought in Mary Ellen O'Toole, who ended up picking up the reins after you, right?
Yeah, I signed off right before I left. I signed off on Mary Ellen O'Toole and Mark Safrick and a handful of others that would represent probably the fourth generation of profilers.
Yep. And you're a protege of John Douglas, and you and John have been friends for 30 years, 40 years?
Yeah, I was just counting the years the other day. It's been just over 30 years.
Yeah, and we've been. How long have we been trying to get him to come onto the show? And he's a big shot over in Hollywood right now with Fox News and all that other stuff. So maybe we'll get Johnny to come over, but
well, we can try.
Yeah. Well, the real profilers are tough to, you guys are always tough nuts, to move around, and but
he's a busy guy.
He is a busy guy, and we love him. He's done a tremendous amount of, in my opinion, God's work in this world that is, really needed. He what was it like being under his wings and being in the same room where you guys are, looking at this stuff?
Well, everybody, of course, not only respected John, but and still do, at least all those whom I'm familiar with and associate with. But John, and I think a lot of times people kind of get the impression with some of his books, because he speaks in the first person a lot, and the things that he accomplished. Well, number one, he did accomplish all those things that he talks about. He was the pioneer of profiling as we know it, and is the pioneer of profiling. And he's a very, very confident individual. And so sometimes that confidence can come across as overbearing to some people, and until they get to know him. And then they realize that, no, this is confidence. This is not ego that's coming out. It's absolute confidence because the amount of cases that he's worked and the accuracy of the details. And then once you get to know him, you realize what a gracious human being that he is, and funny. He's one of the funniest guys I've ever known. He's got a great personality. As you can imagine, you've got to have some kind of a personality to deal with this material and to compartmentalize that material and then live a normal life. And he was very, very supportive of everybody that worked with him. And he looked at us as working with him, not for him. So we were very fortunate, those of us who had the opportunity to learn from him. He was certainly my mentor. And he treated everybody with respect and dignity as a fellow worker, not as a subordinate.
Yeah, and I have to be honest with you, all the years that I've known you and had the blessing to sit and kind of like Tom and Dean, I think collectively, we feel the same way about you. I mean, we've had the exact same experience with what you just said. I mean, I can tell you, the very first, when we first met back in the day, and it's been quite some time now. I'm not going to tell everybody how old you are, but
did I have a few more hairs?
No, you had a couple, not many, but you had a couple. And it's always nice to bump into somebody over serial killers or killers, and the fact that when my first impression I remember vividly was you've always been so humble, yet so knowledgeable in relationship to how you project that information out into the public. And within us as sworn law enforcement at the time, and the fact that we've had opportunities and blessings to teach together. I mean, I've always felt that the day you said, okay, you're ready, it was kind of a major honor. And what's really been cool is the yin and the yang of where Dean and I come from. Dean in the medical examiner coroner's world, and then Tom, in the investigative journalist world, and me in the investigative side of things. It was always really cool to see, how you're kind of like that trampoline, just as an analogy, where we just throw it, okay, and it bounces all over in the net, and then it comes back to us and said, "Oh, by the way, have you considered or have you seen?" And we're like, I can tell you, I can't tell you how many times for me, it's like, oh my gosh, I missed that. Mm-hmm. And so you really have been given a huge, huge gift. And I think this book is reflective of that, because everybody that is in those pages, first of all, you brought everybody to those pages. Tom made them come to life. And now you're continually teaching and saving, countless lives all over the world, not just here. I mean, we've got people from all over the world, just even on this podcast. But when they buy this book, what was your intent, Tommy and Greg? And then Dean, I'm going to give you, 5-10 minutes, whatever we need, right? But I just want to be a fly in this conversation. What drove it? And then I want to talk about how that mindset is in play with the Delphi case and inside of the Summer Wells case. So who wants to take that kind of concept, that idea that I just presented?
Go ahead, Tom.
Are you okay? Yeah, I wanted to jump in here first just because I echo everything that you just said, Chris, about Greg. We had that fun little interaction, but to Greg's credit, he kept inviting me back, and I think he saw that we wanted the same things, right? As an investigative journalist, my whole goal was to give a voice to the little guy, so to speak, right? The lone person, maybe victim, that didn't get that voice, that need a little bit of power behind it. And that's what Greg's always been about, right? Let's make sure we get to the truth. Let's make sure we get to what it is we need to get to give our victims that can't speak for themselves a voice. And I think that's where our friendship began, and it's just gotten stronger throughout the years. So you ask about the book and what the intent was. It was kind of interesting because, and I'll let Greg speak to this here in just a second, but he had a literary agent on the East Coast that once he left the FBI wanted him to write a book. I think it was called Chief. And it was about, hey, this is what I do. I'm amazing, right? I've done all these cases, and it was all just about glorifying Greg. And Greg was never comfortable with that. We actually tried to placate the agent a little bit and do that, and he just didn't. No, more hype for Greg. And finally, we sat down one day, and Greg just said, "Yeah, I'm just not comfortable with that. Let's just do our own thing. Let's go a different direction." And that's where Predators came from. Is we just said, well, what good can we do? And as we talked about it, we realized that getting into the minds of these violent serial criminals is good, and it's important for law enforcement, and cases can be solved. But so many cases can also be prevented if the general public understands the opportunities that these people are looking for, right? And so as we got there, the risk continuum and all those things that you all talk about, we talked about that. And we would always ask every subject that we talked to, or that Greg talked to, or that, I'm sure Dean talked to, one of the key questions is, what could your victims have done to avoid being victimized by you? And their answers, if they were sincere answers, were golden. And we could relay that to the reader, relay that to the general public. Even we have a chapter in there about a guy that is in prison for I think it was 95 counts of rape. That he committed over a 6-year period. And when we asked him that question, it was interesting because his target was always single young mothers. And he would just go in the middle of the night looking for anything that suggested it's just a single young mother. I can get into an open window or an unlocked door because they're exhausted. And then his MO was to pretty much just say, if you do what I say, your kids will be fine. And that's how he would get his way. And so when we asked him, what could your victims have done to avoid being victimized by you? He was very thoughtful. And he said, if each of them would have put a pair of dirty old construction boots on the porch, I'd walk right by it. I didn't want the fight. I didn't want any of that. And so those were the kinds of things that we were looking to do. And Greg was always on that same page. I met Dean a year ago. As we did these newer chapters, Dean was all about that. And it's just been a pleasure working with people like this that want to do something that's going to gain the greater good.
So I want to bring everybody's attention to Brandy Neal is in here in the chat. We have just under 1,800 people right now. But Brandy Neal is the mother of Michael Vaughn, the little boy missing out of Idaho. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, Brandy, you and I have chatted many times. So what I'm going to do at the conclusion of this, is connect you with the Cold Case Foundation, with Dean and Greg behind the scenes, so that they can connect with you guys. And I know you guys are good with that, because I just know how you are. And and that's kind of my responsibility anyway, right? Isn't that what you tasked me with, Greg?
You got it. Let me just say, guys, thank you for all your kind words. This is not a show about Greg, but thank you. And it's not my funeral yet, but I get a feeling what can be said. So I've got two of you already scheduled now for to come and visit me there. Let me just give you a little bit of a history of predators and how we got to this point. Predators is a combination of work between myself and Tom McHoes and Mike King. We interviewed some inmates around the country. And we've included a number of cases that were part of our casework individually and then collectively. And what we wanted to get across to the public and to professionals is lessons learned. We wanted to ensure that this was not just entertainment, because you can look at a lot of different types of true crime books, and sometimes it accentuates the negative and glorifies certain aspects of the crime that we definitely did not have an interest in doing that. It places too much emphasis on the offender, who the offender is, what their background was, why they may have done what they did. What we were interested in was certainly not bringing attention to the offender or their difficulties in life, because all of us have difficulties in life. The bottom line is, in fact, all those, say, serial offenders who may have had difficulties in their childhood, we can tell you that a very small percentage of people who have difficulties in their childhood, whether it be domestic violence, child abuse, sexual abuse, etc., a very small percentage will go out and commit crimes and use that as the explanation of who they are today, so to speak. But what we wanted to do is focus on the victim and what we could learn from, number one, introducing the victim, but identifying those things that the victim could teach us as well, not just the offender. We did go talk to the offenders, and some of them were very, very helpful, as Tom has already illustrated for us. And there are a number of other cases that we talk about. And our original book was, 2007, I believe. And this is the second edition to the original book. And we've included, it's now a paperback edition, and we now have just included cyber stalking, for example, or cyber crimes. As we introduce that concept and the various ways that crimes are committed using that medium, it's endless. The potential is endless for contact between a stalker, a cyber stalker, introducing themselves, for example, to a innocent victim and making arrangements to connect with that victim eventually, after having presented themselves as somebody who, in fact, they are not. In fact, they're looking for a victim. They're a predator seeking a prey. Certainly, this is not the case across the board, but we're talking specifically about those who utilize that medium of exchange to commit crimes. And so what we want to do is get across to the reader and to the professional that lessons learned to reduce the potential of victimization. We wanted people to understand that there are things that they can do in principle that will reduce their potential for victimization in various different types of crimes, and frankly, in all crimes, by simply asking themselves some questions and analyzing the situation that they may be in at the time. And we'll talk about it as we go along, but just to kind of lay a foundation, there are three questions we should be asking ourselves anytime during the day in our interactions with people and environments, circumstances, situations. And that is, who am I with Where am I? And what am I doing? And as we ask those three questions, these are principles. You ask those three questions yourself, engaging what your risk level may be as it relates to being in that set of circumstances or the situation or environment that you're in terms of where you are, who you're with, what you're doing. And if you're not comfortable at all in that situation and environment or with that person and the set of circumstances, then listen to that voice that typically each one of us have had experiences in, that intuition, that gut instinct that tells you something's not right. Get out of this situation. And then all of a sudden we'll experience what we call the social conscience. And that is, oh, well, we shouldn't be rude. I'm sure they don't. And then we project our own value system into that situation where that person, I don't want to hurt anybody. Therefore, they don't want to hurt anybody. I should be more understanding. And so we talk ourselves out of that initial instinct to get out of that situation and move on. And I pose this to the audience. Each of us have been gifted, if you will, with intuition, gut instinct, whatever you want to call it. You can look at that from a purely instinctive situation, or people also refer to it as a spiritual inclination. Call it what you will. The point is, we all know what it is. We know when, for example, we have a sense that I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be in this place. I shouldn't be with this individual. And people have a lot of experience in that area. And typically when they follow that instinct, if you ask them, were you sorry for it? Were you embarrassed by it? Would you want to do that over again? Typically, they're going to tell you, no, I'm glad I did follow that instinct. Versus the person that argued with it, for example, and went along with that situation, environment, circumstances, person, only to end up having a horrible experience. Many of these people, and most, are going to tell you that they had an experience, they had a feeling, and they debated it, they argued against it, and they opted to stay in that situation that turned bad. And typically they're going to tell you, yeah, I wished I would have followed that instinct. So I don't want to discount, certainly we can logically, rationally ask ourselves these questions, but don't discount that instinct that we all have, that we carry with us day in and day out.
So to dovetail into that thought process, Coop, what does the panel think about? What is the suspect thinking when you've had, when we've sat down with these guys? What do they look for? What are the vulnerabilities? And Dean, I'll start with you up there, and then we'll kind of go around here. But let's on these kind of when I throw a question at you, so that we can, for the sake of time, get to some of the other questions that are going to pop up in the panel here, and then talk about the specifics about Delphi and Summer. But what do they say? What are they looking for? I know Tom talked about, the guy in custody for all the sexual assaults. But what's going on up there? What's going on upstairs? What say you?
I think one of the things that's really helpful when you kind of contextualize all this goes back to the actual title that Greg chose for this book, and that is Predator. And I think when we put ourselves, part of the problem is we don't live most of our lives out in the wilderness where predators are. We periodically, maybe in a community, we'll have a predator come down into the community. I'm talking now about wild animals, for example. So you may have a part of a larger area, and all of a sudden maybe a mountain lion comes down into that area, and then the community goes on high alert. When you live or you go out into the wild, part of what you have to do is put that framework into mindset, and a mindset that says, hey, there's animals out here that see me not as a friend, not as somebody that they want to get to know. They see me as part of the food chain. They see me as somebody that they can take advantage of. And so, part of my career was up in Teton County, which is in Yellowstone area. And one of the things that we talk about a lot with tourists and people coming into that area is to be of a right mindset and know that when you're going out into, Yellowstone National Park, Grand Teton National Park, this isn't like going to Central Park. This is an area where predators that can take your life live, and there's all kinds of things in that wild environment that can be a threat to a human life. I think what happens to us is we get so used to living in these metropolitan areas, and Greg said this phrase earlier, where we project our value system onto the people we meet. So this notion that somebody is actually literally a predator who is hunting us, who wants to come and do damage to us, is so foreign that when we are confronted with it, our initial response is that can't be happening. And so it continues to kind of get us in deeper and deeper and deeper. When you're in the wild and you see an animal, are you trying to get closer and see if you can get a better look, or are you starting to move yourself back out of that area? Are you looking for your alternatives, your safety places? And so I think to kind of now switch that over to when Greg's talking about predators, not every person that I come in contact, obviously in my community or out there, is a predator. They're not somebody who's trying to destroy me. The problem is, though, if I don't see that as an option or something that's really there, I set myself up to oftentimes become a victim much quicker than others. And I think one of the things we struggle with a lot in the foundation is that, and I hear this a lot in the general public, don't shame the victims. And I would just address that head on by saying, whatever happens to a victim, it's the person, it's the offender who's doing this. It's not them. And I want to be clear about that. But I also think that it's important that we make people understand that we can put ourselves, sometimes very unconsciously, into a situation that raises our risk level, causes us more danger. Going out and camping and having food in your campsite in certain campgrounds is no big deal. Going out and having food in your campsite in a area where there's a lot of bears is extremely dangerous and heightens your risk. And so I think one of the things we have to realize, and we see this a lot in the victimologies, is that victims sometimes make decisions that, not intentionally at all, but they inadvertently put themselves even in greater harm's way and greater danger. And I come back to this word, because they don't realize they're in the presence of a predator. That's different than being in the presence of somebody who's maybe not a nice person. That's different than being in the presence of somebody who you don't like. It's different than being in the presence of somebody who's rude. We're talking about being in the presence of a predator, and then recognizing that we can make some decisions that cause us to be far more vulnerable than we really realize. And unfortunately, sometimes then it's way too late. So I think it's always easier to be much more cautious than it is to come in with this kind of all of our defenses and our senses down. And the last thing I would say about that is, you mentioned the cyber stalking issue that was added with this new chapter. And I think that one of the dangers that we're seeing with particularly the internet and cyber predators is their ability to really groom people and convince people that they're just good friends. That I've known this person forever. They've never met them, but over a period of time, because they've engaged with them so many times, and so maybe initially they're really kind of not sure. But all of a sudden they get into these relationships with people. They've never met them in person. They assume, hopefully they're doing some video type chatting like we have, but there are actually cases where people have never even seen a video presentation of the person. They're exchanging photographs. They may not even be exchanging a photograph of themselves, but that whole process is about grooming that individual, getting them right to where they want them. And then because they're a predator, then the attack happens. And we see that with children. We see that with adults as well. And so I think those are all areas that have to be considered when you're dealing with this field.
Great. Actually, that's a good segue into, Greg talking about the victimology in relationship to not all of these predators they have a victimology sometimes. And how does that develop itself? And let's use the Summer case as an example, right? I mean, if a suspect's going to take a high risk to go up on that property, they've pretty much groomed themselves in relationship to understanding what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. I mean, explain how that all works in the mind of these guys, Greg. What's your thoughts?
When, from an investigative perspective, oftentimes it can be overlooked how important this key to the investigation is, because we get wrapped up as an investigator with all the pressures of the politics, the department, the family, the public, and we can get into a situation where we're reacting to a lot of things that are happening around us, and oftentimes, as a result of that, we'll neglect taking that logical, sequential, step-by-step process to the degree that we should and could, by wondering, all right, what's the first question I should ask about this case? And how will the answer to that question begin to lead my investigation rather than react to it, with all of these things coming at me? And when I say me, I'm talking about the investigator, the group of investigators, the department, the family. And the first question that should be asked is, who was the victim? The more we understand the victim, the more we begin to understand who the offender was and is. Because the more we understand that victim, the more we begin to appreciate also why that victim may have been selected or targeted, or was it a victim of opportunity? And when we say why, we're talking about not just convenience and accessibility, but specifically also motive. And if we can begin to hypothesize a bit about motivation, that opens up some crystal key information that will help to focus our investigation on probabilities versus possibilities. So we take a look first at the victim and try to understand why they became that victim. We want to know everything we possibly can about them, with their age, their sex, obviously, their background, experience, their education, their criminal history. There's about 30 some odd different dimensions of their life that we really try to glean from. And then based upon that victimology, we want to assess what we call a risk assessment and get a sense for, all right, based upon their lifestyle, first of all, we want to understand to what degree does that lifestyle put them in a position of potential risk of becoming a victim of that particular type of a crime. And then after we've looked at the lifestyle, we want to know what were the activities that they were engaged in at the time that this crime was, or just proximate to the time the crime was being committed. In other words, did they place themselves innocently, ignorantly, or negligently, sometimes recklessly, into an environment, situation, circumstances that now all of a sudden elevates their risk to becoming a victim of a particular type of a crime. Once we take a look at the lifestyle and determine, for example, all right, well, if they're low risk, the chances are, what we've determined over hundreds of thousands of cases, is that the lower risk the victim, the higher the probability that the victim has been targeted and selected specifically by the offender. On the flip side of that, the higher risk the victim based upon lifestyle, say, for example, prostitutes, drug addicts, gangbangers, they live high-risk lifestyles. They place themselves in an environment, situation, circumstances that are very risky, and within the company of oftentimes strangers that they don't know much about, if anything, or it's very short term. So the higher risk the victim, the higher the probability that that victim was probably selected as a result of opportunity. So now you've got two different extremes. Now, it's certainly possible that a low-risk victim, let's say a child in most cases, would be considered a low-risk victim because most of their time is spent there with the home environment. They're not in an environment where they're just walking the streets unattended most of the time. That may be characteristic of some, but typically not, that they're being cared for by a known group of people who have immediate access to them, who are familiar with their activities, who have control over them. So the lower risk individual may be now placed into a high risk situation because of an environment, situation, and circumstances that they either put themselves into or somebody else has put that victim into. And now all of a sudden the risk level is raised. So it's possible you can have a low risk victim that all of a sudden now falls in a high risk category because of that environment, situation, and circumstances. Meaning, where were they? Who were they with? What's the background of those people that they're with? What's the lifestyle like in the case of a child? Who's tending them? Who's taking care of them? Are they being taken care of? What the normal routine and pattern is in that child's life on a day in, day out basis. And so we're trying to identify some characteristics and factors that may have elevated the risk level or decreased the risk level. And while you elevate or decrease, you start to focus your investigation on probabilities of potential individuals who would have access to that child, who are very familiar with the child's patterned behavior day in and day out, who have control over the child because of that lower risk status. In other words, they're placed in an environment not based upon their own decisions typically, but by other people's choices and decisions who have power and influence over them.
So yeah, I mean, let's use Summer, right? I mean, she's and Dean and Tommy. I mean, we all when this whole thing went down, you guys remember? I mean, behind the scenes, we kind of assembled a conference, for lack of a better term, and we all came to the conclusion that Summer was a low risk victim. She, obviously, she disappeared allegedly out of the basement of her home. That was the initial reports. And then we concluded with all the experts and, Greg, you driving the team, we concluded collectively that there was a low probability that this was a stranger abduction, that there was a higher probability that there's a familiarity with not only the geographic aspect of where this took place, but inside of that environment as a whole. Do either of you want to, kind of dovetail into that thought process of, because here we are now a year later, and we still don't have her. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in social media and, and all the other things, right? But here's a situation now where she's still not been found. And 5-year-old little girls just don't vanish, nor do little boys in Idaho. They just don't vanish. So thoughts on where I'm going there in that thought track. Dean, you want to start us off? And then Tom, you kind of weigh in for a second, then we'll go over to Greg. How about that? And make sure we all mute out while each of us is talking. So Dean, you start us off. And we'll, just a couple minutes each, and then we'll shoot up to Greg. Okay.
Well, I think one of the things that we've talked about that is important to keep in mind as well is that it's not just necessarily an abduction or, somebody has come onto the property, but I think there's also the possibility of accidental things can happen as a result of an accident. So if she's accidentally, if something happens to her accidentally, then that can get, we've had cases before where something happened that maybe wasn't intentional, but then things are covered or changed because people don't know, people panic. They're not sure exactly what to do. So I think there's a lot of things that can be happening here, but I think that one of the concerns that you always have is that we're looking at all of the possibilities, but that we also recognize that most likely we're in a fairly narrow window here. The other thing I think the public has to keep in mind is there's, one of the things that I always remind families when I'm working with them is that, the first question everybody wants to know is, what happened and then who did it? And those are all great things. And obviously we want to get those answers, but particularly if we're dealing with moving a case forward, we also have to look at it from the perspective of there may be, and law enforcement may know exactly, who did it or what happened potentially, but that doesn't mean they have enough information to be able to facilitate an arrest. And it may not have enough information, even if they could make an arrest, to get it through the court system. So there's all these different kind of thresholds that we're trying to get a case to. And I think the public gets frustrated sometimes because we want things to move quickly, but when you're keeping all of those pieces and elements alive and understanding all those dynamics, they do take much more time. And I think law enforcement, it's easy for everybody to kind of armchair quarterback something from a distance. It's a lot different when you're having to carry this thing all the way through the process. And if mistakes are made and you jump the gun, we've worked cases before where people have been overcharged. The wrong person, either was overcharged or they didn't go through the process properly. And now we're in a situation where years later, looking at I'm talking about older cases, but these are older cases that as we've looked through it, because of some of those things, now there's no way that they can be recharged because of the way the court system played that out. So I think there's just a lot of reasons to be very cautious and more patient. That's hard a lot of times because I think what drives that for all of us today in America and really in the world is we live in such a quick response world. We can get information so quickly. We can Google it, we can run out on, make phone calls across the world. And so everybody has this expectation that things are going to happen so quickly. And most of the time when we rush, mistakes are made.
Okay, Tommy, what say you?
Yeah,
Make sure you mute, Dean.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay, good. No, anytime this case breaks my heart. Anytime it involves a child, it's just crushing to everybody, and it reverberates, right? And I'm looking at your chats, and I'm seeing so many people who are saying, I'm taking this information, I'm passing it on to my children, my grandchildren, those kinds of things. And what has brought to mind for me is a conversation that I had with Ed Smart, Elizabeth Smart's father. You're talking about children being taken from the home. And we were talking about, as I was talking to him, we were talking about, well, what do we do to teach our children, right? We talk about, stranger danger and some of these other things. And he shared a story, an experience, I should say, that he had with Elizabeth after she came back. And of course, she came back. There was all this publicity on her, and rightly so, because everybody was trying to find her, and the more publicity there was, that ultimately helped find her. But then after she came back, now this publicity could be overwhelming. So they had all kinds of experts come in and teach her, okay, what to do if somebody who's not in their right mind approaches you, et cetera. And they thought they had the bases covered. And they were in church one day, and this is several months after she had been found. And she gets up to use the restroom in the middle of church. Nobody thinks anything about it. But looking back at it, there was a young couple sitting behind them. She goes to the restroom. The young lady gets up and follows her in just a couple minutes after, corners her in the bathroom and just starts screaming at her and saying all kinds of things like, I know you were in love with your perpetrator. Just all these horrible things. She hasn't come back. So Elizabeth, a couple of her family members go in, and they have to kind of, force open the bathroom door because this lady's kind of wedged herself against the door in between Elizabeth and saying these horrible things. They finally get it open. The lady runs away. Well, the lesson in all this is, while they got all this great information, what they didn't do is have Elizabeth role play. So while she had been tutored, when the time came for something to happen, she just froze, right? What do we teach our kids? Be respectful of adults, right? Don't talk back to them. Don't yell in church. Don't scream, those kinds of things. And so, for him, the training then became role play with your kids, right? So we don't know what happened in Summer's case, but in an abduction case, in some kind of case like that, we need to let them act out screaming, yelling, calling for help, getting more ears and eyes on a situation where somebody can come to the rescue. And that's what comes to mind for me when we think about this case.
Okay, Craig?
Yeah, those are all great observations and comments. And just to approach it from a purely investigative perspective, in terms of probabilities, based upon the fact that she's a child, she's being controlled by those who are caring for her, and specifically those who are caring for her that day. She lives in a rural area. She's not exposed to a lot of passerbys, if you will. There's not a lot of people that live up in that area. There's not people that are driving through the area or walking through the area. It's rural, private, for all intents and purposes. So in that very short window, is it possible that there could have been more people at that particular time that's coming through, driving through, walking through? Is possible, but as far as we know, that never happened. Nobody was seen. There's no reports of anybody being seen, etc. So in a case like this, the natural thing is to focus on those that are the center of that relationship and those associations. Who is it that takes care of her? Who has immediate access to her? From children to adults. And as Dean has indicated as well, a lot of times these situations go from accidents to intentional cases. In a case like this, you have to consider all possibilities. But to begin with, we want to focus the investigation on probabilities, and that is the most probable aspect of it with respect to who had control over that day are those that are close to her, those who have close association, whether it be close family members, or maybe they are family associates, visitors that may have been there that day. But that's the probability that they're most likely not a stranger. It's somebody that she was familiar with, unless she walked away on her own. And that's certainly possible. She certainly could have walked away, and we see cases like that. They walk away and are found a mile away. I was reading a case the other day about a young child that had walked away from its home and was found a mile away in an abandoned barn. Those things don't happen very often.
Right.
But this little guy made it. And fortunately, he was found in time to save his life. And there was no predator involved. So we have to consider all those aspects. And what are the chances of those things happening?
Yeah, I mean, and thank you. Those are all great points. And, here we are a year later. They've done, numerous searches, obviously, in that region, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't, I mean, folks are feeling that, that all that area has been saturated with search and rescue and et cetera, but there's still that possibility, to your point, right, Greg, that she could be within that geographic region somewhere between a rock or anything. I mean, not to be graphic because obviously these are children, but that's still on the table. I think I think it's important for the audience to understand that when an agency goes to the behavior science unit and they present a case and you guys start taking a look at it, back in the day, it's an intense process. And now the development of the card teams who respond, directly to these missing children, and they spend weeks with the family and stuff, and then they conclude at, even in their own assessment back to law enforcement, we do not see evidence of a stranger abduction. Okay? And it was basically the same conclusion that the Cold Case Foundation had come to in relationship to the amount of information that was available at that time. And here we are a year later, and they just had a recent press conference, and TBI, FBI, sheriffs, everybody said essentially the same thing. Look, we don't have any evidence that points us in any other direction so far. So therefore, we really don't have an update. But it doesn't mean that the accident theory is off of the table, and or that she could have been outside, walked away, or it could be foul play from somebody in the inner circle that you're talking about. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Again, we're dealing with probabilities, and so part of the role of the investigator is to exclude possibilities in that process, and to focus on now. Okay, so we've got these. We're left with these probabilities. Which of these probabilities have evidence to support which one is most likely to have occurred over another? And so then we start looking at additional factors involved. As an example, if it's believed that one of the possibilities is that an individual close to her has had something, or has knowledge about her disappearance, or has had something to do with it. So all those people are going to be interviewed. That's a natural process. And certainly the family should understand that. If it's explained to them that law enforcement doesn't just jump to conclusions. It's a long, drawn-out process, and it causes great frustration with victims' families, because it does take time. And that's because their responsibility is not just to find out what happened, but what didn't happen. And to exclude, by process of elimination, those possibilities that don't have sufficient merit, because there's not evidence to support it. And by doing that, they're very responsible, because the last thing they want to do is end up making a mistake in that investigation, focusing on a person or a hypothesis that ends up being out in left field. So you lose more time.
Yeah, and that's to Dean's point earlier, right? Where even in Elizabeth Smart's case, they focused on the RSO, for so long, and there it was, because I remember we talked about this. There it was, right in front of them the whole time, and there was a lot of excessive energy, for lack of a better term. So this is a perfect segue into the predator mindset now of this guy on the bridge with the Delphi case. I mean, here we have his voice, we have his picture, we have him praying, and the video, and these girls as they say in Hawaii, right? Be akamai, I mean, be aware of your environment, situational awareness, as we called it in law enforcement, right? But they have all of the they have all the ingredients, the children do, all of the ingredients of, you know, saving their own lives, and yet the perpetrator has not been captured yet. So when we think about this guy up on the bridge, and I don't want to talk about who they're looking at, right? Greg, I'm more interested in, and Dean and Tom, your thought process about if they came to you and they came to the BAU and the Cold Case, or the Cold Case Foundation, for lack of a better term, let's educate the public on how would you take this on, and how does it fit?
Well, first of all, as I've indicated, we would start with victimology and understanding exactly why they were there at that particular time, what they were doing, what that environment posed to them in terms of potential risk, and then focusing down with a laser beam, so to speak, on the time frame. As I recall, I think they were dropped off about 1:30, and they were expected to be picked up within a couple hours. So this crime occurs within basically a couple hours, particularly if you were convinced that the young ladies were committed to being back at the meet time to be picked up at about 3:30, I think it was, that afternoon. So something happens in between where the connection is made between the victims and the offender. So we're wondering now what's happened, what approach was used, and we know a little bit about that because of the heroism, really, of young Libby, who has the wherewithal to record this individual approaching them, and that the recording lasts for 43 seconds. So not only does she have a photograph, but also a recording of his voice. Now, there's only been 4 words that have been released to the public that we're familiar with. I think the words are guys. He's referring to the victims. Down the hill. Now he's directing the victims down that hill. But we don't know what else is being said. We know that the offender, at some point, first of all, what is he out there for? He's prepared to commit a crime. He has weapons on him. He doesn't hesitate to approach them. And he doesn't hesitate to tell them what he wants done. Now, he's able to take a look at those victims and assess their vulnerabilities right away. And he predicts that what he's going to do, his behavior, there's going to be a reaction to his behavior based upon what he sees with those 2 young girls in the way that they're behaving. At some point, he is either experimenting, and that is, he makes this approach, addresses them, refers to them as guys, and then directs them down the hill. And evidently they comply. So at some point, he has the ability early on and is confident enough that if he makes this approach, that he's going to get them to respond the way he wants to. He's prepared to do this thing. He's been thinking about this. And he didn't just wake up that morning thinking about it. This isn't the first time he thought about committing a crime like this. He's looking for the right victims at the right time in the right environment, situation and circumstances that, to his planning and fantasy that he's been engaged in for a significant period of time, is going to match. The stars are going to line up for him. And they did.
Help educate the audience. I mean, because I know where you're going and I love it. Absolutely 1000% love it. Help the audience understand why that correlation is made in terms of what you just said, you know, that he just didn't wake up and decide that these two were going to be, you know, that day.
Yeah,
Go a little deeper into that if you can.
sure. I think it's important to understand that people don't just wake up. People that commit these atrocities and any significant crime like this, they don't just wake up and impulsively go out and commit a crime. That's where the hypothetical fiction comes in about insanity. These people are not insane. Now, morally, you could say they're insane, morally, meaning that they make no sense at all from a moral perspective. But mental insanity, they understand what they're doing, and they understood at the time what they were doing was wrong. And you can determine that based upon all the behaviors that they engage in during the commission of the crime, right before the crime, during the crime, and after the crime. That they understood that there were consequences for their actions. They understood that there were results for their actions. And this particular crime has all those elements. This guy understood completely what he was doing. He'd been thinking about this for a long haul. So it's important to understand that this is not an impulsive crime, meaning that it didn't have to be those two victims. But I would theorize in a case like this that he's not looking for adult victims. He knows that the more vulnerable, the least resistance, the more compliant, it reduces his risk level, number one, of being caught and identified, and it increases his risk level of being successful. So he's determined before the type of victim that he's looking for, even the age range. He has an interest in younger females in this particular case that he's been fantasizing about and what he would like to do. Now, there's a lot that's being withheld by law enforcement for good reason that was incorporated into the search warrant. Some suggestion that there were, in terms of behavioral aspects of this crime, that there were signature aspects of the crime that were identified, but they've not identified exactly what those were, with the exception that there are some references to staging. And I take issue with that. I don't know if that's a reference by the media or the author who writes that in there. I question whether or not that term was used in the search warrant. I've not read the search warrant, only references to it, because this the staging, it would be an inaccurate term, generally speaking. This is posing. They were posing. This individual took the time to pose these bodies. There's a difference between posing and staging. Staging typically has to do with manipulating the crime scene to make it appear that it is something else. You know, a burglary, a rape, let's say a domestic situation that turns into a rape homicide. And somebody attempts, let's say the individual ends up being a domestic partner, and he tries to make it look like a burglary gone bad. It wasn't at all. It may have been domestic. So the body would be staged to look like there was a sexual assault when there may in fact not have been one. So you're trying to change the focus of the investigators onto the motive for the crime. Posing of the body is more of the signature where you're now projecting your not the MO perspective, but the emotional and psychological perspective of the crime in terms of what it means for the offender. There are things that he did with those victims that meant something to him. What we call signature is that behavior which goes beyond what's necessary to successfully commit the crime. This now is a projection of the personality of the offender into the crime scene. It means something to him. And we know that, I guess I'm jumping ahead. I should probably go back to the victims, but we can talk about some of this other stuff later if you want. I'm jumping ahead, so I apologize to the audience. Let's go back to the victims. Let's go back to the victims as to why he selects those victims. They are pre-selected from this perspective. They're a certain type that he has a preference for. Not only a preference sexually, but he has a preference for as it relates to easy to dominate, manipulate, and control. They're coming along at the right time, in the right place, in the right set of circumstances, in the right environment. He has pre-planned this for a long time. And to the dismay of everybody that's ever become aware of this crime or any crimes like it, it seems like these are random cases. And in some manner of speaking, you can refer to it as random if there's no particular association between the victim and the offender, in that they weren't targeted because they were known, but they were targeted because they fit a profile, if you will, of the type of victims that he's been fantasizing about. And he knew that it would increase the success of his crime, plus he would satisfy his urges and inclinations and what he's been thinking about for a long time.
And you bring some of those examples in your new book, where you talk about, the significance of, some of these perpetrators and these offenders that you've worked. And just for the record, everybody, we got about 2,500 people here so far. And we have Greg Cooper with us, who was the former unit chief of the behavior science unit, Dean Jackson, and now Greg is the executive director for our foundation, the Cold Case Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. Get over there. You can always help support these families that don't have the resources internationally. We have about 100 plus experts that from everything from DNA all the way down to medical examiners, investigators, professional journalists, etc. And we are always looking for the support to help these families free of charge when they request it. They come to us, or in conjunction with law enforcement. And, I've told my audience here that we have a caper down here in Texas. I haven't told them who or what, when, where, why, for obvious reasons, right? But at the same time, the fact that we're working active, homicide investigations around this country. So we have Greg here above us, who's our executive director. And then we have Dean over in the upper right-hand corner, who's the deputy director of the Cold Case Foundation. And then we have Tom, who's kind of our go-to guy for investigative journalism. And, he connects a lot of dots for all of us and makes us look right. And he and Greg have recently updated their book, Predators. And you can get it. The links are below us down there. So if you want to go get it, you can just click on that link. It will take you right over to Amazon and you can order it there. I recommend it personally to every person out there. It doesn't matter who you are, what you are. It is an important read because the aspects of the internet and the power of the internet today and the fuel available on the internet, which drives some of the fantasies in relationship to some of this behavior. It's important that you guys educate your children as well as yourself and pass it along, because there's a lot of things that are going on here. So that said, go ahead, Greg.
Chris, yeah. let me just add one thing, if you don't mind. Let's focus on the predator in this case, for example. Excuse me. So what type of a person would select two young girls in a remote, isolated area, make that approach with sufficient intimidation to manipulate them, to garner their compliance and submission, just the approach alone, what does that tell us about this individual? Without even looking at or talking about the crime scene, which is where I start getting off in the weeds a little bit. But so let's talk about the guy who makes an approach like that. Why does he approach two young girls instead of a young woman, an older, adult, who may be jogging or who may be taking a nature walk in that area? So you have to look at it from a preferential perspective. Number one, preferential sexually, and then preferential also because they're easy to control. So what kind of an individual is attracted to that situation in terms of their behavior and interaction with adult women? What level of confidence do you think that they would have with an adult female who is mature, who has confidence in herself? How does that extend now to what types of behavioral or personality characteristics would we expect to see in an offender like this? Do you think that they would be confident among women who would be jogging or making approach to a woman to have a natural, consensual relationship with somebody? No, you wouldn't, because this is exactly why he's focused on children, and in this case, 13 and 14 years old. It's easier to impress them, to put them in a position of vulnerability. They're easy to manipulate. And so you would expect that to bleed over, in a sense, in his normal relationships with adults. This is not the guy that drives a sports car. This is not the guy that's looking to go out with an attractive woman who can carry on an intelligent conversation. This is a guy that feels more comfortable around children because they're easier to influence because of his own adulthood. And consequently, for whatever reasons, he has developed a sexual interest in them as well, most likely. And we don't know in this case whether or not there has been sexual activity. It's not been disclosed, whether it has been or hasn't been. It doesn't seem to have been addressed, at least as far as I've read about the case. That would tell us a whole nother aspect of this individual's personality. But this guy lacks confidence in social circles. He withdraws from normal social circles. He's not confident in carrying on an intelligent conversation and a mutual conversation with an intelligent adult female. He's a loner. Very good, Channel. He's a loner, I bet. You're right. He is a loner. That's exactly right. Because he's not comfortable with people who are adults. And so he's going to focus and address those whom he feels he can influence and control. So it does give us a little sense on the behaviors. This is what profiling is about, is taking a look at the behaviors, what we refer to as the 10 filters of behavior, victimology being the first. And then we look at 9 other filters. And then we glean from that personality characteristics of the offender to tell us who this individual is, how he relates in society, what interests that he has, what his background is, what kind of criminal history might he have. But all of that is deduced from the more information that's available to us about the crime. And a lot of that has been withheld for, I'm sure, good reasons by law enforcement. For example, the 43 seconds of recordings. Can you imagine what we could learn if we could hear those recordings and the exchange and the interaction, what was being said, how it was being said? Because typically when we look at any kind of a crime, we break it up into 3 types of behavior: nonverbal behavior, sexual behavior, and verbal behavior. And that gives us a composite of who this individual is.
Interesting. Dean, what are your thoughts? You've been quiet up there in the upper right-hand corner.
I was thinking, and maybe this is kind of a way to bring some of this all together. I think the public wants to always know, what can I do to help? People are always, I think the reason people are fascinated is they feel bad. They want to move it forward. And I would say a couple of things. One, it's easy to get caught up in kind of hypothesis and, almost we become fantasizers of what we think could have happened, and then throwing those out into the public arena. And all that does is really, it just begins to complicate everything for investigators and the people that are really working. So my first word would be, I caution people to just throw things out as a conjecture and say, well, if they thought about this or that. I mean, there's a lot of things people have thought about, but you're really trying to put weight to each one of those steps. But I'll address this from the standpoint of looking at so many old cases. One of the things that we stumble across a lot in these older cases is we find information from individuals. They'll have little nuggets of truth. And I find myself always asking people, why didn't you come forward with that piece of information? And there's a lot of different reasons. One, and probably the most prominent, is nobody ever asked me. So there's a tendency for people who oftentimes do have good information to not bring it forward because they've never been asked. So I think the first thing is, if there's a possibility, and not taking it public in the sense of going out to the world and the masses, but find who's working those cases. And sometimes, there's so much coming in. We've been able to help clear certain information and then bring it to law enforcement. We're more than happy to listen to what people are, have got to share, if it's legitimate and it's truly key stuff. And I'll give you an example of this. So I was at a store for my wife. We were doing some remodeling, and I was tired. I'd been working all day long on these cases. So I wasn't really that engaged. I was just kind of biding time, and I was over in the corner. My wife's dealing with the salesman, and so she got to looking at something else. He came over and said to me, he said, what do you do? And I'll be honest, I had on short pants. I was trying to relax. I didn't really want to get into it. And I had that moment where I thought, am I going to actually tell this guy, and where's this conversation going to go? I thought, well, I'll tell him. So I said, I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Cold Case Foundation. And he looked at me and he said, you mean like serial killer stuff?
That's why we don't have friends.
Well, I said, well, yeah, kind of that stuff. And he looked at me and he said, some people shouldn't work with kids. And I said, well, that's true. They probably shouldn't. He said, I got to tell you, he said, I was a Boy Scout leader. And he said, I was at a Boy Scout outing. And he said, the Boy Scout leader that was camped next to us never should have had anything to do with kids. And I said, really? He said, yeah. So this guy was totally fixated on knots. And he said he ran those kids around, like he said, the way he treated them. He said he would come into our place like he was inspecting everything. He said it was just unbelievable. And I looked at him and I said, are you talking about Dennis Rader? And he said, how'd you know? And I said, well, because that's part of his behavior that, was uncovered. And he said, yeah, he said, I was actually at a camp jamboree thing or something with the Boy Scouts. And he said, his troop was next to mine. He said, I was next to him for 3 days. And he said, I just saw so many little things that really disturbed me. And he said, I moved from Kansas. He said, I live out here now. But he said, there were little things that he said, I probably if I'd have thought about it, I could have at least said, has anybody looked at this guy, about whatever? And I think there are little nuggets of information that people have sometimes about somebody that, hindsight's 20/20. We all know that. But I think in these cases, people say, well, they've gone on for so long. Well, if it's gone on for so long, maybe there's some things that you wouldn't normally bring forward, but you're concerned about, that you need to find the right people. And that's my caveat to this. I don't think you bring it out and go public with it, but find the right resources out there. Share it with somebody who knows what they're doing with this information. because it may be that it is a little bit, it may be that little nudge that law enforcement has or whatever, because there are cases where law enforcement didn't really look, but they didn't have the full circle. It was part of that person's personality or their behaviors that nobody knew about. We always talk in terms of people have, a public life, they have a private life, and they have a secret life. And those are where you find those little nuggets of truth that open the door for you to do some things. So I think I'm always cautious with people, because I see a lot of times a lot of damage is done because people project things out there that they don't really have a basis for. But at the same token, how many times have we had cases where somebody finally comes forward and they didn't talk because they were either afraid of somebody, or nobody asked them, or they were not sure this was really that important. And sometimes it becomes one of the most important pieces to the puzzle. So my guess is, I'm not suggesting that people in either one of these cases have all the information, but my guess is probably there are some people out there that have some thoughts and some ideas that are based in some truth here, some realities that if law enforcement knew it, it could be that little piece that would change. And I think the other thing, and we try to be careful as well as a foundation, one of the things that helps us when we look at cases is when we work with law enforcement, we get access to everything. So in both of these cases that we've talked about tonight, we don't have all the information. We've not seen everything. And so, it's difficult for us to draw full conclusions on things without seeing all of the evidence that we have that's available there.
Spoiler alert real fast for Greg. What the public doesn't know is how many times did you meet, right, with Wichita before Dennis was caught, and how many times did we teach that case before anybody knew it was Raider, right, Greg? I mean, how many times did you, right, with the foundation?
Yeah, and that's right. In that case, actually was before my time as a profiler, but we utilized that case to present characteristics of a classic serial offender, serial killer in this case, and sexual sadist. And gosh, how many times? Probably hundreds of times.
Yeah.
I mean, he was active for 20 some odd years, or inactive for about was it 10 years or
about 10, right, if I remember?
Yeah. And then started again, and then that's what led to his ultimate capture. But we used that as an unsolved case for years and years and years, and then showed from a analytical perspective how we would break that down into personality characteristics of the offender. And fortunately, I can tell you in all the cases or all the classes that I presented that case, we were accurate.
Yep. And folks can grab that same type of training through the Cold Case Foundation now with Cold Case Live. So we can talk about that in a little bit. But Tommy, I want to hear from you real fast about, and then Greg, I want you to kind of, I want to set the stage for the two different personality types, the bridge guy and the personality type that potentially could have two children, right? Michael, a little monkey out there in Idaho, i.e. he's reported walking out of the house. He's seen in the neighborhood, and now he has vanished. He's just vanished. And his mom, I've been working with her, behind the scenes, and they have a full-on fluid investigation going over there, as we're all aware of. But those two personality types, a 5-year-old, a young little boy who just had his 6th birthday, so we got 2 5-year-olds at the time of their disappearance who are still gone. But then we have these 2 teenagers, and I'm not, disrespecting either one. Okay. But at the same time, I think it's important for our audience to understand the mindset of why these victimologies are selected correctly. in the mind of the perpetrator, so that speculation and all the other stuff that goes on with it, like Dean was talking about, on YouTube, we kind of control it in relationship to, facts, information that we know about, and just kind of, maintain it consistent. So, Tommy, what are your thoughts about what you've been listening to?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we started working on this book, it was late 90s. And as I've been listening to, to all of this, where there's been some talk about technology and some other things. And at the end of the day, the thing that comes to mind for me is human nature is human nature, right? These predators who do this are people who are looking to fill legitimate needs through illegitimate means, right? And we all have, for example, a need for intimacy, for love, to be close to somebody. But most of us don't take it, right? Like some of these sexual predators, etc. They take it because they either don't know how to, or they don't want to try to learn how to do it legitimately. Ask somebody out on a date, right? All the typical things that you would do. So they just take it and they victimize people as they do that. One thing that I do want to say, and we talked about Doug Rader, we feature a person in this book by the name of Oliver Garish, that Greg, I'm sure, remembers. And in prison, he provided us with a list of grooming tactics, and he was in prison for, I think it was 590 counts of child molestation, and he'd gone on for years and years and years. And he was a master manipulator, not just of children, but especially of parents and guardians. He knew how to manipulate with the best of them. And that was probably some of the most valuable information that I feel that's in the book. And he lists out dozens and dozens of these grooming tactics that he used, from everything from being an ice skating instructor to just laying in wait, to becoming a scoutmaster, to a dance coach, to you name it, just a kind neighbor. And then he would just get the trust of the parents and move on and do these despicable things to children. Now we've got Oliver Garish's online, right? Now they have a tool that can be used, apps, the internet, you name it. But we also have the tools that these young ladies, as Greg said, had the wherewithal to utilize, right? We've got phones, we can video anybody, we can record anybody. And so for me, as you mentioned, I'm the guy maybe that connects the dots. For me, I think we need to start getting specific with the public when we're asking for help. I think it used to be, hey, if you've seen this, anybody that looks like this person in this sketch, call 1-800 da 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 da. I think we can go a step further now, right? I think, that video has been shown. I think we can start specifically asking questions like, when's the last time you saw somebody that looked like this, and we show that picture? Please come forward with specifics, right? When was the last time you were in this park and maybe you saw somebody that looked like this that was specific, right? So this way it's not taking law enforcement down a rabbit hole just by asking the general question, hey, if you have any information, right? But if we're asking these specific questions, people can come forward with specific information that will help you follow specific leads. I don't know if I'm off base there.
I love that. I love it. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. It just seems to me we have the technology now. The bad guys, so to speak, are using it. Let's use it to get hundreds of thousands to millions of people to help us with these investigations. We all know that law enforcement resources are down. It's just difficult to be in law enforcement these days, and in terms of a resource perspective, use the public, but let's get smart and specific about how we're doing it.
Awesome. Craig?
We wanted to talk a little bit about what's the difference between a child abductor and somebody like that individual is responsible for these two young ladies, 13 and 14 years old. And to be very specific on these cases, we don't have enough information to give a full profile, but we can make some observations, and I can give you some generalities. And what I would that we see oftentimes as it relates to a young child, there's a couple things here that are happening. Number one, it may be fantasy driven. You may have an individual, if there is, it depends what their motivation is. Okay, it completely depends on the motivation. When you're talking about a pedophile, for example, if a pedophile is interested in gratifying their sexual needs through children, and pedophiles exclusively gratify their sexual needs through children. They're not experimenters, typically. They're sole target. So it depends what the abduction is for, if that's what it is. And versus an individual who is simply, say, they're out on the hunt. They've got a lot of stress built up. They're on the hunt. They're looking for the opportunity and for a victim. And they have made the decision that if that opportunity presents itself, they're going to take advantage of it. While they may have a preference of a certain type of victim, oftentimes they will take some steps back and take whatever's available to themselves. Let's take a look at Bundy, for example. As far as we know, the majority of his victims were college age, very attractive young women. But his last known victim was little 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Comparatively, one's wondering what's the difference going on here. Was he now seeking younger victims? And from our perspective, we would say no, but what he was under a great deal of stress at the time. He was looking for a victim, and he found one as close to what his preference was that he wanted. Approached her, and then was able to get control over her. So while that was not a preferential victim, it was a victim of opportunity that was a substitute victim, if you will, for what he really wanted, but was available to him at the time. Versus a pedophile who's only focused on children. This individual with our two young ladies, this is a guy that most likely prefers an adult experience, but is too weak and inadequate to develop a legitimate relationship with them. And most of any of his experience you're going to find, regardless of his age, most of any experience that he's going to have is going to be most likely with younger people that he can influence, dominate, and manipulate. At some point, he has expanded his fantasy beyond the sexual interests to include homicide. So the probability here is that this was most likely a motivated sexual homicide. Whether he achieved any sexual assault, we don't know, because it's not been addressed. We don't know. That doesn't mean that he wasn't motivated by that. It may suggest he was so inadequate that he didn't even attempt any sexual gratification with the victim, either before or after their death. But he, according to the accounts, he did participate. There was a lot of blood, evidently, at the crime scene. It was reported. So he employed a method that was sure to adequately and successfully commit this crime, which included homicide. From the time that he manipulates them from that bridge down to the crime scene, he's not committed the atrocious crime. He's not committed either a sexual assault or a homicide. He could have turned and left, could have lost confidence at some point, and just forgotten about it and said, forget this, I'm not doing this. But instead, he's so focused on this because that it's fantasy driven that he's committed and dedicated himself to accomplishing this particular crime in spite of whatever his preferences may be. But he's too weak of a personality to go after a legitimate relationship. Instead, he selects these, in his mind, easier to dominate, manipulate, and control. So you've got two potentially different types of offender. One may be focused on pedophilia, not knowing enough about the case and the crime itself, including the one with the two young ladies. We don't have enough detail to give you a very good or complete picture, but some generalities. But in either case, both are inadequate type of personalities, weak, lacks confidence in their interpersonal communications and skills with adults, and even older children, in the case of abducting a 5-year-old child, if that's in fact what we have here is an abduction. Because they go with, number one, ensuring the success of their crime. They go with achieving their fantasy and what they're comfortable with, what their level of confidence and confidence is, socially and emotionally, psychologically.
Hang on, sorry. Awesome, just awesome. Some folks are just jumping in here, so I just want to let everybody. They're asking who's on the panel. So tonight's guest in the upper left-hand corner is Greg Cooper, former unit chief, FBI Behavior Science Unit. Now he's the executive director of the Cold Case Foundation, and then right below him in the Greg Brady spot is Dean L. Jackson, deputy director of the Cold Case Foundation. And then below Dean is Thomas McHoes, investigative journalist, and one of the co-authors of Predators, also a member of the Cold Case Foundation. And then I'm that pretzel boy down at the bottom. So we appreciate you being here from all over the world. Our topic tonight is we're discussing predatorial behavior and a new book with additional chapters in it that that Greg and Tom have compiled with Mike King called Predators. And it's available on Amazon, and you can, we highly would recommend you folks, grabbing it. And Buddy's in the background somewhere, sound asleep again. He wants to go out on a walk with Mom. So she's going to grab him, a little boy, but we're going to keep maintaining because I promised everybody we could take some Q&A directly with you guys. And if you're comfortable with that, maybe we can, kind of move over, to that place, unless there's other things, Greg, that we need to hear, because I mean, I've been listening to you for, since, how long have I known you?
Haven't put you to sleep yet. It's been a long time. What, 25, 30 years?
And are you sure I'm still your friend? All these years.
Yeah, you're my good bud. Yeah.
And the other thing I tell people all the time, I mean, tell everybody what we're doing with the first ever assembled homicide task force for the Bureau of Indian Affairs through Operation Lady Justice, right?
This is exciting. Dean, why don't you take a minute? Tell everybody about it.
Well, so we were contacted by them about 2 years ago following an executive order to create Operation Lady Justice, which focuses specifically on missing persons and homicides of women on native tribal lands. And they reached out to us. They wanted to put together cold case centers for around the country to try to centralize and work on these cases, and then also bring in investigators So we've been working for the last, I think we started a little over a year and a half ago, and have been working to train their investigators and getting ready. In fact, in August, we head back out for 2 more training sessions, one in August and one in November again. And it's just been great. I mean, these are some wonderful people, very dedicated, committed. There's a lot of difficulty working these cases, particularly trying to get information shared. And so we've just had the opportunity to work with them and meet some great investigators out there. And so that's kind of where we're at on it.
There you go. And we're headed over to do a couple more of those things coming up. Okay, so let me go into the Q&A here. And folks, if you're just with us so far this evening, welcome to the interview room again. And we're so grateful that you're here, and we hope that you'll and by the way, for the first time, we're simultaneously broadcasting on Rumble over there as a backup. Just you never. And my mother always said, make sure you have a plan B just in case plan A doesn't go quite correctly. So if you are a member of Rumble, please go over there and subscribe. We love having you guys with us tonight as well. It's simulcast on both of these platforms. I'm not going anywhere up from YouTube. I'm staying here. But at the same time, I just want to make sure that we recognize our guest over there and also recognize all of our subscribers here on YouTube, all of our channel members, all of our Patreon members. We are so grateful to each and every one of you. And without you, Miss Robin, we could not do what we're doing here tonight by bringing these amazing men together to educate all of us, including myself. I've been around them for many, many years. And every single time, it's like listening to E.F. Hutton, talk. So I'm all ears. But that said, while we get ready, let's do a quick roll call on, oh, what? Are people clapping? Get out of here. Get out of here. Okay.
But are they standing? Are they standing?
I think somebody got a new toy.
I got a new toy, and I'm going to try it out right now. So hang on. So everybody, let's weigh in. Let's kind of lighten this up for a second before we get into a heavy Q&A, and ask any question about the perpetrator tonight, or thoughts about the perpetrator or predators in relationship to, not who they're looking at in the Summer Wells case and or in the Delphi case, but what are your thoughts about predators in general, and what you want to know? So I'm going to go ahead and start running through some of these names, and we'll see where we come up. All right, so we've got Florida, California, Ontario. Show me where you're at, everybody. Pennsylvania, Idaho. Thank you so much for being here, Brandy. This is Michael's mom, Little Monkey, and we're going to help you. We're coming. We're going to help you, Brandy. Okay, so don't give up hope. Don't give up hope on that little guy. Florida's in the house. New Jersey's in the house. Thank you, Teresa, for always being here. Well, that's Teresa Huckabee, but Teresa Milligan, Mimi J2, Miss Sophia, Stephanie Erb, all of our mods, we sure love you guys. We can't do this without you. Ontario's in the house, Alaska, Ohio, Kansas, Michigan, North Carolina, Indiana, Iowa, Chicago, Australia, Ohio, Indiana, from all over, New Jersey, Missouri, Oregon, Australia again. Thank you for being here. Pennsylvania, Florida. We got a lot of folks from North Carolina, New York, Florida, New Jersey, Salt Lake, Rhode Island, our great friends up in Canada. We love you guys up there. Thank you so much for being a part of our show this evening. We appreciate you. Maine's in the house. Love you up in Bar Harbor, Maine. That's a great place, great towns up there in Maine. We love our folks from Tennessee, and we pray daily for this little girl, Summer. She's always in our prayers. Texas, a lot of folks from Australia. And Stephanie, thank you so much for being here as well. We love you. You're one of our greatest mods, as well as some of the other gals here. London is in the house. Canada, Colorado. Wow. They're all here. Everybody's here. And what's amazing is these children have brought the best out of, I think, each and every one of us, in many, many, many ways, many ways. But at the same time, I've always felt the responsibility, and you guys know me, you've known me for a couple of weekends, that when we make a commitment, my problem is I can't let go. And so hopefully we're making a difference for many, many families and children as we press forward. Okay, so prayers from down under, and let's go ahead and grab some of these questions. And whoever wants to grab this, Michelle, has to be somewhat impulsive unless he knew they were going to be there. And I'm assuming this is Delphi. Greg?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, that may appear that way because most likely he did not know that they were going to be there. But what he was looking for, and that's what we're trying to focus on here, is why he did select them as the victims. It was not impulsive from the perspective of his preparation and his intent before he even set out that day, in my opinion. I believe that the stars lined up for him, so to speak, with the environment, the situation, the circumstances, and the victims. So from that perspective, it was not impulsive. What we have here is an individual who is prepared to commit this crime in his mind over and over again. And when the opportunity presents itself, then he's struck. So from that perspective, you could say, well, it was kind of impulsive. Not impulsive from the perspective of preparatory. Impulsive suggests that it's a reaction, that there was no premeditation involved. So that's what we mean as it relates to randomness versus pre-selection.
Greg, I think a good example of what you're trying to maybe will help people understand. So Jeffrey Dahmer had this fantasy that he would pick up a hitchhiker and be able to take that hitchhiker back home and have sex with him. That was this fantasy that was driving him. This is in the early part of his experience. He then has a situation where his parents were out of town. He's driving down the road and he actually picks up a kid and takes him back to the house, all of a sudden believing now that this fantasy that he's always had is going to be fulfilled. So this is part of what Greg's talking about. The random part was, and where things kind of came unglued, was that he starts realizing after talking to the guy and they spend some time together that this guy is not going to have any kind of relationship with him. It's not going to go the way he wanted. And then he ends up killing him, in this kind of panic state. So what you have is that he starts out and gets to that certain point. Now things can change. And I think we see that sometimes in these cases, is that what was fantasized and planned, and as we look at it, then we can see where the wheels kind of came off at certain points of it. But these people are thinking about these kinds of things, and that's hard, I think, for the general public to understand. But if you think about it, I think Tom made the comment, I know Greg teaches this a lot, that these are people trying to fulfill legitimate needs in illegitimate means. And so, in a general sense, a lot of times people who are successful at something they fantasized about being really good at whatever it is they're doing. They've gone through their mind, what would it be to go out and do this, maybe as an athlete, or what's it like to be standing there in the Olympics and, you know, getting the gold medal, or those types of things. So there's this fantasy that motivates people to keep moving forward on that. And I think that's where people get confused, thinking this random aspect of it. And that's, I don't know if that helps, but it always helps me when I'm kind of trying to process through all that.
Okay, we've got 20 questions backed up already, so we're going to have to be succinct and right on. Okay, so speaking of cyber crimes, who could he have lured both of them? That's a question. Tommy, what do you think, based on what you've written?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I think it's a possibility. I don't think we take it off the table. But it goes to what Greg and Dean were saying. These guys have a scope, right? And he goes to the park. It's almost like a fishing expedition, and he finds what he's looking for. It could be that, or he could have lured them.
Okay, Greg, you want to dovetail into that, tying in?
Well, I know that there was an individual that they were looking at that was catfishing, and they found out what his background was, which was pedophilia. And that he had been in contact, presented himself as an individual, a male model, if you will, and to them, I think it was Libby, and that Libby had also communicated with him. So yes, these individuals could have reached out and attempted to contact, presented themselves as somebody that they weren't. And as I understand it, there was actually contact between this individual and Libby the day before the girls were killed. And they looked at this individual, but has yet to been referred to as a suspect. But absolutely, that's the medium, so to speak, where people can connect with would-be victims.
Okay, so this question here I'm going to take. Chris, I've heard that you say they have BG praying. Where did you get that? I don't know when I said that. So whoever, Karen, I don't know where you heard me say it, but I don't recall saying that. But if I did, I do not know where they got BG praying personally. So if you can show me that, I'll be able to clarify what you're talking about. But at this point, I can't answer your question. Let's see here. This is more of a comment. They have no empathy or remorse. I think we can all agree on that one. Yeah. This one here is, I think part of the enjoyment of these guys is the planning of their crimes. Greg?
Yeah, in fact, what many of them will tell you is that was the best part of it, was the planning and the fantasy that goes along with it. That was the most exciting, the most alluring to them, that which motivated them. And it was after they
Did I just lock up, or did you guys just lock up?
Can you hear me, Chris?
Sorry.
Oh, yep, you're back.
Sorry.
No, you're back.
Okay.
You went to space. I thought Elon Musk came by your house and picked you up and brought you back.
Yeah. He's going to give me
Welcome
a Tesla.
back, Greg. But yeah, I think we got most of that. Go ahead.
Okay, just what they'll tell you oftentimes, the most exciting and the most thrilling was the planning and the premeditation and the fantasy. Where they ran into trouble was during the commission of the crime and subsequent to the crime, that they didn't think through. They weren't prepared for the type of response of the victim, for example, or what it was going to do in order to avoid identification subsequently.
Yeah, and I think Sharice just clarified the last question. Previous, I said praying, not praying, but praying, and thank you so much for keeping me out of hot water again. That's why I love this audience. This question here is, I'm going to grab it real fast. When teenage boy essay, a 4-year-old, teenagers keep the rest of her life, there's a high probability that this boy will reoffend. Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? That means yes. Okay. the interview room. How can law enforcement or justice system put a stop to predators prior to harming a victim, assuming the victim incurred harm prior to anything being done to stop criminals? That's through your legislators. And Tom, go ahead. You're an investigative journalist.
Yeah, no, you know what? That is a great question. I appreciate you letting me take this one. Honestly, I think, yes, legislators for sure. But I think this is one of those areas where we take care of our own little corner of the world sometimes, right? And I think sometimes we've gotten to a place where we've isolated ourselves a bit, whether it's through electronics, social media, etc. And I think sometimes this might sound a little Pollyanna, but I think sometimes a kind and a friendly word to a kid that doesn't look happy can make a world of difference. Just letting him know, yeah, you matter. I see you. Can do it, and at least maybe start them on getting the help they need before they even get to that point. But that's just my take.
Okay. Greg, Dean, do you think this was his first murders?
Based upon some of the comments with respect to the crime scene and references to what we refer to as signature, and that being, they describe the crime scene as having or depicting a lot of blood. So they don't go into the details of the injuries. So if there was a lot of blood, that suggests that there was either a lot of injuries or certain anatomy of the victims had been attacked. For example, the neck area that would have produced a lot of blood flow as well. So if that's accurate, we would look at that potentially, or a lot of stab wounds, for example, if a knife was used. If we don't know, they haven't articulated that. But the amount of blood suggests the possibility of overkill, if not some specific certain behavior that may suggest other possibilities that we don't need to speculate on. But the other thing was the body was posed, and we also know that the individual took souvenirs. I've heard or read anything from 1 to 2 pieces of clothing, either from one or from both. Either way, that stands out as a signature aspect of the crime. So does the potential of overkill or other variations of that, and so does the aspect of posing. In my experience, signature suggests that the probability exists that this individual has either committed crimes in the past and or most likely will commit crimes in the future, because you've got a lot of emotional, psychological investment into the crime and the crime scene, a projection of the emotional and psychological needs of the offender.
Yep. Okay. So the next question sounds like a plan was in place. Dean, what say you?
Yeah, I think definitely there was a plan. Whether it was a plan that included these two specific individuals, that's still to be determined. But I think an overarching plan. I think one of the things that we see a lot of times is that in these fantasies they've created, if you think of it like a play or a film, and they are expecting, and they see themselves as the director kind of watching this whole thing, and they're trying to make that come to light. Most of the time they find that what they wanted to see, it doesn't materialize the exact same way. So now they've got to go back to refigure out how, is it the victim I'm choosing? Is it the way in which I'm doing it? So they're constantly working to develop all that out. But I would think there is definitely some level of planning here that he's thought through, at least in his fantasy, as to what he would do if he had an opportunity.
Okay. Any chance the person who said guys down the hill was someone else standing behind the girls?
Don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, there's certainly a chance.
Here's a good one. What stresses out these predators?
Victim reaction, victim response, lack of compliance, lack of submission, resistance, things not going according to plan. He may have a preference of a certain type of victim, but decides to take the opportunistic victim. There may be more violence than they anticipated. There may be more blood than anticipated, rendering them incapable of completing their sexual interest and intent. So a number of potential things.
Thank you, Sandy. What hallmark traits are associated with predators? That's kind of an open. That's just we can answer that one for 30 years.
Yeah, it really depends on the personality type, doesn't it? But think of it this way. Think of a hunter. Think of the guy that likes to hunt. What he goes through in preparation for that hunter. I mean, a serious hunter. What he goes through, the kind of money and time investment that's involved before he goes hunting in terms of research, what types of weapons he's going to use, where he'll go, if he's a fisherman, where that watering hole is that he's interested in going to, what type of clothes will he wear, what time of the day will it take, what does that the prey, so to speak, P-R-E-Y, look like for them at this particular time in their life when they commit that crime, because that can change as well based upon their experience and maturation criminally. So if you think about the activities that a hunter, a serious, significant hunter goes through in anticipation of hunting or fishing or any, for that matter, any hobby, golfer, bowling, whatever the interest is, people go through a lot of preparatory time, spend a lot of time and money in anticipation of that. And it's the same types of things in terms of investment that an individual will go through in preparing to commit their crime.
Yeah, and we're not saying hunters are doing this. We're saying that
No.
they go through the same thought process in relationship to how they do what they do.
Yeah.
Awesome. Boy, these are some really good questions. So this one is, let's see here. Most of them suffer antisocial personality disorder. They have no empathy or remorse. You agree with that?
Yep. And succinctly, I think that's general. There's some dimension of antisocial personality disorder, certainly morally. Yeah.
Did I already put this one up? What type of predator will be more likely to be impulsive to stalk?
Than to stalk. The more disorganized predator, the individual that hasn't, number one, doesn't have much experience at committing crime, that hasn't given enough time in preparation for it, or maybe early on in their criminal career in terms of experience and level of competence. So they strike out impulsively, so to speak, although mentally it's not necessarily random, than to identify, for example, a target. One is impulsive, one is typically one of opportunity, versus a stalker is typically a person that's been targeted or as thought criminal suggested, opportunist.
Yeah, I think you could see that even translate into other types of crimes. You know, somebody who goes into a store and sees something, realizes maybe nobody's watching, then it's just an opportunity. They grab something versus, you know, somebody who really thinks long and hard about how to really set up and go in. There's some pretty extensive thought processes even in theft and robbery and those types of things. It's that constant, difference between somebody who's getting started and, has a thought, when be I to do that, versus the person who is really making almost like a career out of it.
Yeah, and
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah,
Tom.
yeah, and I think also there's people that develop into that, right? They, like you said, they see an opportunity. We had, the person that we talked to that 95 counts of sexual assault of single young moms. He didn't start that way. He started breaking into houses to try and find cash for drugs, and he just saw an opportunity. He saw, a young mom sleeping, and he thought, hey, I've got this opportunity, and he took it. So it can also, unfortunately, evolve, for lack of a better word.
Okay. So do you think the bridge guy was waiting for his victim?
I think most likely he was on the aware, looking for an opportunity. It looked like, from at least the depictions that I saw, that this bridge is pretty significant in terms of its length, and that he was at one end while the girls were at the other in that approach. And so he's walking down that bridge, thinking about it, and mentally preparing for it. So I think he sees them and entertains that thought, consistent with his fantasy, while he's walking down that bridge.
Interesting. So thank you. A salute there. Statistically, can you tell us how many times child predator victimizes before being caught? That's kind of a interesting question, but there's a wide range. But go ahead, Greg.
It depends what age they are when they get caught. For example, as we've talked about Oliver Ben Garish, he suggested that there were over 300 victims that he was responsible for before he got caught. So it depends on their age and how sophisticated they are. It can be hundreds, or it can be one or two. It just depends on their level of sophistication and how long they've been at it.
They can also get caught in one jurisdiction, and then sometimes they'll migrate to another jurisdiction, try to shift their identity. Yeah, that's exactly what Garish did. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. This one's a good question too, from Ann. He sounded confident. Do you think it was his first time going from fantasy to his reality?
I don't think necessarily it was his first time. I think that there are other incidents, not knowing enough about the crime scene and the level of sophistication engaged in how he committed the homicides. I think there were other approaches that he's made in the past. There may be other types of assaults, other efforts that have been made, but he'd been practicing before, most likely.
Interesting. I'm going to put that one up here. This is the first time I've ever seen this question. How common is it for two serial killers to team up?
Not very common, mostly because the personality types, you will see it. For example, Bittaker and Norris is an example, who met each other in prison. One was in for rape, one was in for homicide. They got together in prison, went out and then victimized several young women in their vehicle van, which was referred to as the murder Mac, where they would take them into that van, tie them up, and torture them and murder them and sexually assault them throughout that process. But you have two different personalities involved, and typically there's a dominant personality. One may not be into, for example, the one that was into the homicide was more focused on the gratification of the homicide and the effect that threatening the victim and putting the victim through torturous different scenarios to see that response. That's what stimulated, I think that was Norris. I may have my names mixed up there in terms of which one was focused on the other one was sexual assault. So his gratification was in sexual assault. And then you get two of the worst case scenarios put together, and you get a horrible duo.
So this is an interesting question. It's because of the two guys they're looking at. What about a father and son? How unusual would that be?
In my experience, it's also unusual. Usually one wants to be the leader, one wants the sole gratification of doing everything and not sharing that experience with somebody, because typically that creates conflicts. Plus, from a practical perspective, now you've invited somebody else that's aware of your crimes as well. Lake and Ian are another couple. But for most of these serial offenders, they want to maintain privacy, confidentiality, secrecy. Number one, for their own personal pleasure, but two, also for practical purposes, and that is to reduce the chances of being identified, apprehended.
Okay, so just a couple more here, and then we're going to give you guys the last word. Greg, you go last. We'll start with. I'm going to go through a couple more questions here. It says, had these girls been there before, a place that kids hung out? I don't have that answer, and I don't know if any of you guys know that answer. There's a lot of information floating around.
Yeah.
This one here is, how would law enforcement determine what DNA was the correct match, since it would have been messed up? The bridge is very rickety, dangerous, etc. That DNA would go to folks in the laboratory, and they would separate every piece of it as much as they could, and hopefully they'll, call Josephine, or Francine Bardot, and see if there's anything that for the Bardot method that she could pull off.
Yeah, a lot of touch DNA involved.
Touch DNA. I mean, she's amazing. I mean, she's gotten stuff off of not only rocks, but shell casings, and she is the absolute king or queen in her case of the method. She actually invented it. And then this comment here, I hope you guys do this again, talk more, take more questions. Okay, now the last question for the evening from I Am the Storm. Each panelist, most infamous case or creepiest interview subject. And Tommy, you start.
Oh my gosh. I think for me, the one that's the most bone chilling is Oliver Garish, with the hundreds of child victims, and it's the most chilling to me, just because he didn't go after the children in terms of gaining their trust. He went after the parents, and that's very scary, that you could trick, for lack of a better word, that many parents into just handing over your child to somebody that maybe you've just met, whether it's a swimming instructor, skating instructor, whoever. So for me, that one was the most eye-opening, and probably the number one reason that I'm proud of the book, and hopefully that, look, if everybody read one chapter, that would be the one I would say, read that one, protect your kids.
Awesome. Dean, do you remember the question?
Yeah, I do. I guess my answer would be there's some we're working on right now that unfortunately I can't talk about, but maybe one case that does stick out in my mind back when I was in the coroner days was we had a case that was a homicide. And I think the reason it sticks out in my mind is it was in a very rural area. It's a very gruesome homicide. And as we were coming back into town, we'd been out, done the investigation. It's the middle of the night. And as we were coming back into town with the body, the alternator started going out on our Suburban. And so it was one of those nights I'll never forget. We almost not made it back. So looking at the crime scene, having all that, I was young in my early years of that experience. And then to have those kind of other aspects of it, it always is one of those cases I remember, just because of, I still can picture that night we're driving down. The moon was out. It was just, it's almost like you would see in a movie, and we kept watching our lights getting dimmer and dimmer and thinking, one, we don't know who did it. Two, we're out in the middle of nowhere with this body potentially, and we could break down. So that one kind of sticks out, I guess, for that reason.
Greg, I know your list just goes on forever.
Well, there's a few. Let me, for the purposes of our audience.
And remember, it's YouTube, so.
Oh,
right. No, you're. Okay. I'm teasing you. You don't. I'm
okay.
Yeah, but
we, which you can read about in the book, an individual that we had interviewed in Utah State Prison, a guy that had committed 85 rapes and what was it? I'm trying to remember how many states were involved now, but several states, and we challenged him and said, well, 85 rapes, they're successful 85 rapes. That's what he was telling us. And he was eventually convicted, but we asked him, now, how is it that you committed successfully 85 rapes? And what is it that you could tell single women or single women with children, tell them to do to prevent somebody like you from successfully committing a rape in their own home? And it was so simple, is what was so disturbing. And what he said was, lock your doors and your windows. Every victim, every single successful victim that he got in through an unlocked door or an unlocked window. 85 rapes. That was one of the most disturbing revelations that I got in terms of prevention. Such a simple thing.
The interesting thing about, again, I just tag onto that. One interesting thing about that, when we walked out of prison after talking to him, so he'd been there for about 10 years, I think, when we talked to him.
Several years.
And he'd, gone through all the therapy, done everything. And he was very convincing. Like I thought, man, this is a changed man, right? I'm a hardened journalist, investigative, skeptical guy. And I thought, hey, this, if there was, not that I, ever say, hey, let this man out of prison, but I thought, I think maybe this is evidence that people can change, and so we're walking out, and I mentioned that to Greg, and he got that little smile that he gets, sometimes when he's got, a little nugget to give you. And he looks at me and he says, Tom, he says, I agree. He really gives off that vibe, but you're asking the wrong question. And I said, what do you mean? He says, the question isn't, if we let him out, would he be okay? The question is, how much would you trust him to be with your wife or your daughters alone? And I went, yeah, okay, he can stay in there. We're good.
Yeah, which goes into this. Mimi's one of our mods here, so I'm going to let her question in here. Can any predator be satisfied with one fantasy being acted out all of their lives?
Not in my perspective. I think that what happens, part of the frustration for these offenders is that fantasy is ideal. We have perfected our fantasies, our experience that we've created in this fantasy world. It's perfect. The problem is it's not reality. And when we commit a crime, or an individual commits a crime, then what they often get frustrated with is the fact that it doesn't match the fantasy. And so they become frustrated. And you'll see some of the behavior during the commission of the crime that manifests, that is reflected in that frustration, in the way in which they continue to behave during the course of the crime, and what they say, what they do. And so they'll try to come back and perfect it. Typically, our fantasies are far exceed reality, and we're never satisfied with them. Think about that in your most intimate moments and fantasies that you've had. It's very difficult to satisfy that ultimate fantasy in your life.
Yeah, this one here, that is a really interesting thought, right? But I'm going to answer this one. Guys, how do you battle depression while handling such evil? Okay, I'm going to give you my formula for me. One is I'm of the frame of mind that I get to choose every single day who I engage with and who I don't engage with. And if I decide to engage with negative people, then that will lead me into a negative thought process. And so I think the people we surround ourselves with, not only our family members, but in our communities, with inside of our clubs, our organizations, our churches, the people that we support each other in terms of around us, that helps with keeping those thoughts of depression away. Now, are they going to come? Of course. We're all human beings. We're going to have good days and we're going to have bad days. But one of the things that I recognized years ago, and I'm going to be a little personal here for a moment, and these guys know me. When I lost my son in 2003, who was 20 years old, I never thought there was a level of pain that I hadn't experienced in relationship to seeing it in the lives of, the almost 500 dead people that I had worked around and helped investigate. And then my son passed away. And I knew there was a different level and different depth of pain. And as a personal experience for folks that don't know, I was at Disneyland the day he died. It was the happiest place on earth, quote unquote. And my phone rings and it's the police telling me my son passed away in an accident. Now, to me, I can't tell you what happened for a little time thereafter because I don't remember leaving Disneyland. But I remember the feelings of, is this how I need to keep moving? Do I stop now or do I keep moving? And one day, a dear friend of mine, his name, I'm going to say, is Brad Starr. We were at my house and there were friends and families and just everybody was over supporting us. I learned a really valuable lesson of the power that we each hold within inside of ourselves to reach outside of ourselves to support those who are suffering. And at that moment, I was in need. And I saw the people in my backyard and they were planting a tree. And I went to go help them. And Brad stopped me. And he said, "This is not for you. It's for them." And they planted that tree in memory of my son in my backyard. So one of the reasons we do this channel is so that we take care of each other a little bit more. And we try to bring, I hope, a little more dignity to not only YouTube, but to the world and to these families that are suffering. And that it's not about me, it's not about, YouTube, because quite frankly, and these guys know, I don't need this. I'm retired. I can drive around. I work with, for the Cold Case Foundation as the director of National Law Enforcement Relationships. I go out and I kiss babies and shake hands. That's my job. And so, but to see the hate sometimes that comes down in these platforms. We are feeding into the suspects by that hate. We're not feeding into the victims. And we need to have a paradigm shift and reverse it into how do we help the families and not the offenders.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my 2 cents on that question. And by the way, it's a choice now. It's been, 2003. So we're down the road, and time will heal. And Dean wrote a good book about it, actually. And I'll put the link of it. I'll put the link down below at the end of this. But he's got some great insight, especially being he was a coroner, and we'd have to go deliver those messages to families. And he wrote a book about it, and it's powerful. It's a powerful book. But that said, okay, the last word goes to the upper left-hand corner, Mr. Greg Cooper. And then from there, we are going to, I'm going to pull myself out, and we're going to all go to Hawaii. And I want to tell everybody, we love you. Thank you so much for being here tonight for this, program. And guys, thank you, each of you. We're so grateful to each of you for being here this evening. We're so appreciative of everything you give us here on the interview room. And Greg, you know how it goes. At the end, when you're done, buddy, we're going to go to Hawaii. Aloha, everybody.
Okay. Chris, thank you for having us. And it's always a joy to be with you on your show. It's a great success. You're doing a tremendous service, and we're grateful to be part of it. And I think all the viewers and your subscribers all know what a gem that you are in bringing to light so much that seems to be mystified and accentuated and dramatized in the media to the advantage of, unfortunately, or I should say not to the advantage of victims, but so often to the advantage of offenders, as you've mentioned, meaning that it seems to accentuate the development of the personality, what they do, how they commit their crimes, and it turns them into celebrities. And I think the more we focus on who it is that's responsible for our jobs in the criminal justice system, it's not the offender, in my philosophy and opinion. And we need to redirect our focus. It's not the individual that commits the crime, it's the victim who's been victimized. Those are the people that we should look to as our client. We don't serve the offender, we serve the victim. And the more we can amplify the victim and the rights of the victim and dedicate ourselves to supporting those rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, even when the victim has not survived, we then vicariously have the opportunity to do that for them in our pursuit of justice for them. And by doing so, prevent further victimization by that same individual who's committed that crime. I think that's what drives us. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you as an audience about these issues. We're grateful to you for your support. And we want you to know that by supporting what we're doing, you too are serving those victims and helping us to reduce victimization and prevent some of these atrocities that occur in our society. Thank you very much. We hope that you've learned something that will reduce your potential victimization by at least 50%. And in my philosophy, I think reduce it more closely to 70 to 80 to even 90% by just applying some of the principles that we've talked about today. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Chris.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out 24/7, babe. No timeouts, wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah, make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away, you and me, go to our favorite place. Feeling the sun on my face in Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. I need a summer breeze, some fresh air to put my mind at ease. No cares. You wanna come with me? Me and you go to our favorite tree. Are you ready now? We jump on a plane now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. Don't hesitate now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away.